Hello, it's Scott Manley here. Over the last few months, I've been sharing lots of video of me learning to fly, and I wanted to actually talk through some of this for non-pilots out there mainly. So this is me. I've got a camera on my head in the bottom right corner, and I've got a camera on the front of the plane. This is the aircraft. It's an Cirrus SR20 on runway 13 at Noss Field in Novato, or Kilo Delta Victor Oscar. I'm doing the takeoff, and for that what you do is you're putting in full power, obviously, with the flaps at 50%, and as soon as you do that, there is a tendency of the plane to pull over to the left, so you have to counteract that with the right. Now, for Noss Field, when you're taking off on 13, you're headed towards those hills, and on those hills there's a bunch of people who live there, and they complain about aircraft noise, so we are required to turn very early to the left. We're supposed to head to a heading of 080, right? Now, you can't turn too early because there's some antenna there as well, so you have to kind of thread this needle where you don't annoy anyone by flying over their houses. Equally, you don't want to crash into those hills. So on the top right there, that is some data from ADS-B Exchange. Me pointing up there at that time, that was when we reached 500 feet, and you're sort of supposed to say caps available. That's the Cirrus airframe parachute system. You're supposed to tell the world that you're ready to deploy it in an emergency. So I'm heading out in this direction following the noise abatement procedures. I'm then going to turn to the left onto the downwind and climb out, because we're going to head to a practice area to the sort of northwest area. Also, I should point out that the ADS-B Exchange data, the altitude is actually lower than the real thing because the air pressure was higher. So I think the data they get is based on standard atmosphere as opposed to real, the current actual altimeter setting, which varies over time. One of the first things you do before taking off is you get the weather report that'll tell you what altitude you need to set, and that will make sure your pressure altimeter is reading the correct value. Now, for this specific flight, I made a point of taking off just before sunset, because I was interested in doing maneuvers in the changing light, just to see if it would uncover any problems that I have, anything that might be shown up by trying to do stalls and turns when the light is fading. Also, because the sun is setting and I knew it would look really cool out there. Now, if you look in the bottom right, you can see me going through the climb checklist on the multifunction display. This aircraft has those all built in, and as I'm a student training, I'm encouraged to actually religiously use all these checklists. Actually, as a pilot, you're really supposed to be using checklists all the time. So at this point, I've reached over 2,000 feet, and the mountain next to me is about 1,500 feet, so I'm definitely going to be clear off it. So I begin making a turn to the left so that I can catch this gorgeous Pacific sunset on the onboard camera. Now, at this point, of course, you see that the windshield is a little dirty. Yes, I did a complete and thorough pre-flight check of the aircraft to make sure that it was airworthy, to make sure that there was no potential problems with the physical vehicle itself, because after all, my life depends upon it. But I didn't take the time to actually clean the windshield. So this also carries us off towards the practice area that I'm intending to go to. We generally do a lot of the maneuver practice over an area which is sort of north of Tomales Bay but south of Bodega Bay. It's a low-lying area towards the Pacific coast. It's west of Highway 101. It avoids the airspace near Santa Rosa. That's where I'm basically headed at this point. So I'm just heading in that general direction and climbing to about 3,500 feet, which is my target altitude. So yeah, this is a Cirrus SR20. It's the smaller version. The SR22 is more popular, which has a much more powerful engine. But since I'm a student, having a lower power engine is actually a good thing, because when you have a high powered engine, it tends to pull to the left harder, and you need a lot more rudder work and experience to keep it under control. It's a full glass cockpit. You can see underneath that display on the left that there are actually 3 gauges which are backup Those will work if the screens fail, but generally you are using those two, the primary flight display with the artificial horizon and synthetic vision that actually looks like a flight simulator. It lets you see the ground based on GPS data. And on the right you have the multifunction display, and generally that will be showing you a map, and probably it'll be showing you like nearby traffic. So if there's other aircraft in the area, you can see where they are, assuming that they are broadcasting their position using ADS-B. That multifunction display is also used to show the engine information. That's the little strip on the left hand side. It will be used to show, like if you're setting up navigation, you can use it for that to plan your flight out. And there's a whole bunch of configuration and stuff that you can access inside that, and of course the checklists. I've reached my target altitude, and right now I want to get my plane set up for cruising. So this is the cruise checklist, where I pull the power back to about 69%, adjust the mixture so that I'm burning fuel the most efficiently, switch over my tanks, turn off the fuel pump. Aircraft engines, because they operate at a range of altitudes, they tend to be not particularly full of electronics. So a lot of things that we take for granted in engines and cars these days, a lot of automation, does not exist in aircraft engines. You're having to manually adjust your mixture. Startup is not an automated process. You have to set everything right, prime your fuel pump, and turn on the engine, and at the right moment start to bring the fuel mixture in so that the engine catches. So fast forward a few minutes and we start the maneuvers with slow flight. And if you look at the top left of the PFD, that's the throttle setting, and you can see I've dropped it back to like 19%. So what I'm doing now is I'm slowing the aircraft down. If you look at the PFD on the left, you'll see that my speed on the left side of it is slowly descending, and once it reaches about 100 knots, I'm going to put in some flaps. All the time what I'm doing is slowly pitching the nose up, because I want to maintain the same altitude but slow down. And as you slow down, you need a higher and higher angle of attack on the wings to maintain your altitude. Once I get the speed down low enough, I put in 100% flaps, and once I get really slow, I put the power back in. And ideally, you should be able to fly now at a much slower speed. And this is, of course, practice for landing. You need to know how to fly the plane as slowly as possible so that when you touch down, you have the least amount of energy. So the next basic maneuver we demonstrate is a power off stall. So we're flying slowly already. You pull the power back, pitch the nose up, and eventually your aircraft gets too slow, it hits the critical angle of attack. Get a stall warning. First thing you do is push the nose down to break the stall, make sure the wings are level, and then put in power so that you can start regaining speed. At the same time, you have to put in rudder to make sure that you don't fly uncoordinated, and as you pick up speed, you're supposed to take out the flaps that you have set in, and eventually, when you're flying sufficiently fast and your flaps are out, you begin to climb back out at the climb speed of the aircraft. Now there are a lot of other variations on stalls depending on flap settings and power. So this is a power on stall where I put in about 65% power, raise the nose up to about 15 degrees, and again we're waiting for the speed to get low enough, or so that the critical angle is hit. We get the stall, get the nose down, and then put full power in so that we can recover and get ourselves flying again. These are the things that you get tested on in a practical exam, and there's a document called the Airman Certification Standards which tell you what is a pass or a fail. You have to keep your heading within 10 degrees, for example, when you are performing these stalls. The other basic maneuver that they're going to make you do at altitude, and one of my favourite things to do, to be honest, are steep turns. So steep turns is where you have to make a 360 degree turn at a bank angle of 45 degrees or more. So what you do is you find a suitable reference point, such as that mountain right in front of me, and then you start to make a turn. You roll over, you're supposed to hit 45 degrees. Now, turning at 45 degrees does make a lot of things happen. First of all, because you're at an angle now, your nose is going to want to fall down, so you have to pull back harder. because you're pulling back harder, you're now generating more G-force. You're generating about 1.4 Gs. Now, because you're generating 1.4 Gs of force, that means the wings are generating more lift, they're generating more drag, so you're in turn supposed to put in more power to compensate for this. Meanwhile, you're supposed to maintain your altitude to within plus or minus 100 feet, and when you roll out, you're supposed to be within 10 degrees or whatever of your target. So there's me rolling out, and this is the point I sometimes lose it because I forget to stop pulling back and my nose ends up going up and I end up busting through my altitude. I think I did it just fine in this case. The cool thing about this is that if you do it right, sometimes you end up hitting your own dirty air that you have left in the air behind you. I managed to do it pretty much, by sheer luck on the very first time I did steep turns. I haven't always replicated it since, but it feels really good when you do. Now, one thing that I have to deal with that a lot of trainee pilots don't is that the Cirrus has built-in automatic stability protection systems, so that if you exceed 45 degrees of bank, it will use the autopilot to roll you back vertical. And I will inevitably forget to turn this off. And once I hit about 40 degrees, that's when I realize, and so I have to start holding the autopilot cancel button to make sure that I don't end up, so that it doesn't kick in and ruin my perfectly good steep turn with an attempt to roll vertical. And from this, I pretty much immediately went into a simulated engine failure, pulling the power back to zero and talking through how I would deal with such an emergency. So, one of the first things you do is you are supposed to trim for best glide. That is where you adjust the natural angle that the aircraft is flying at so it flies between 92 and 100 knots depending upon your weight. Next thing you want to do is point your aircraft towards some terrain that looks like it might be good. If there's an airfield there, that's the place to go. But in this case, I'm just looking at some sort of barren, flat areas rather than some hills that I was heading towards. Now, I'm going through various checklists or in my head to try to figure out how I could restart the engine, adjusting the mixture, making sure my ignition and everything's on, making sure my fuel tank selector is selected, adjusting the air intake to an alternate, and failing that, you can then dial up frequency 121.5, start talking to emergency services and basically saying, help, I'm going to make an off-field landing. Now, in many aircraft, that means trying to land in a field that looks like it will handle it, but generally the procedure in a Cirrus is you maneuver to a place where you can make a safe touchdown and then deploy the parachute. And I'm going to say, in simulators, I have managed to put this aircraft down in tiny little fields and little roadways, but the official procedures are, just deploy that parachute because it is far more likely to bring you to the ground alive and leave the aircraft in a state that can be reused. So after all that maneuvering, it was time to go and practice some landings, and the place nearby was called Petaluma. It's an airfield and its official designation is Oscar 69. So while I set myself up to approach it, I look up the frequency for it. Specifically, I'm looking for the Common Traffic Advisory frequency, and that's basically like the party line where all the pilots operating at this airfield, they all talk to each other and they try not to step on what each other's saying. So I basically tell them that I'm about 5 miles to the west and I'm going to overfly the field at about 2,100 feet. Now, the runway there is running sort of perpendicular to my course, and the idea is that I'm 2,000 feet up, and if there's anybody flying around the airfield, they're supposed to be either 1,500 feet above the earth or below. So I'm 500 feet above any traffic that's supposed to be circling the airfield. And that allows me to fly right over the middle of the runway and then set myself up for joining the traffic pattern. The traffic pattern is basically has 4 legs. You have you start when you take off from the runway, you're on the upwind, you turn onto the crosswind, then you turn onto the downwind, to the base leg, and then onto final. Now in this case, the active runway is 29er, and that means that people are basically flying from the bottom right to the top left. And because I'm flying to the top right, I need to somehow join the downwind on the top north side of the airfield while descending. So I'm flying towards these mountains, and before I hit them, I need to make a turn to the left, 270 degrees, all while losing 1,000 feet of altitude. So I'm basically flying down towards these hills here, and then I'm going to start making this turn at relatively low power settings, so I'm losing the altitude, and in such a way that it brings me neatly onto this imaginary line where all the traffic is supposed to be. The downwind for Petaluma is on the like the north side of this highway here that runs next to the airfield. It's 1,100 feet up, and they have a specific compass bearing of 110 degrees. So you can see me turn around. There's the sunset. The sun has, of course, gone down by this point. It is doing nothing but looking very, very pretty. All the time, I'm, of course, losing altitude, and I'm trying to make quite a tight turn here so that I can fit this in. So that's me getting pretty close. You can see that highway there. And if you look straight out there, there is a flashing light in the sky. That is another aircraft. That is some person in a fancy Citation jet, and they want to fly straight in and land on runway 29er, which is what I want to do, and I can't cut in front of them. I mean, I could, but they're flying faster than me. It would be a really bad idea, so I have to wait for these people to pass. So I'm just basically going to keep on flying along on my downwind until they pass me on the right, and then I'm going to make a right turn. So for runway 29er, it's called right traffic, and what that means is when you're flying around this box with the upwind and the downwind, you're making right turns all the time. If you're flying on the opposite direction on runway 11, then you're flying on left traffic. Now the airfield will specify left or right traffic depending upon the local conditions. In this case, they like everyone to stay on this side of the highway because it minimizes the chance that if you have a problem that you're going to fall onto people's houses. So look, this is not my usual pattern I would take to land on this runway. Normally I would have turned by now and I would be on my base leg and turning to final. But that other traffic changes the equation. And it's important to understand that we are all agreeing on what's happening here. We're all talking over what's called CTAF, the Common Traffic Advisory Frequency. That's a single shared frequency used by all the pilots at a specific airfield. There is no control tower here telling the pilots what to do from the ground. The pilots are just talking to each other, declaring their intentions, reporting on where they are, and occasionally asking questions of other pilots to make sure that the situation is understood so that nobody accidentally flies into each other. So at this point, I'm basically watching that other aircraft and waiting for them to fly past my right wing, and once they're past, I can begin to think about making that right turn onto base. Now, since they're a pretty fast aircraft, I can turn kind of early, but if they were much slower, you might want to extend even further to make sure that they can get down and off the runway before you. So this is a turn from the downwind onto the right base, and at this point I would make a radio call. I would say, Petaluma traffic, Cirrus, turning on to right base, runway 29er, Petaluma. And of course, I'm getting to see that really beautiful sunset. And since I'm turning onto final, normally at this point I would be putting in full flaps, but since I'm 3 miles away from the runway, we elected to wait to deploy those flaps until we were, we were a little closer. So at this point, I think I'm more or less in line with the runway, so I begin my turn onto final, and the call, of course, would be, Petaluma traffic, Cirrus, call sign, turning final for runway 29. In this case, I think we might have said long final, because we were 3 miles out, and that was unusual. So I think at this point we deployed full flaps, and that meant we needed a little more power. We were below the glide slope, so if you look ahead, you can see kind of a red light and a green light next to it. The red light is the runway slope, like approach indicator. And those indicate red when you're below the glide slope, and they indicate white when you're above the glide slope. There's 4 of them, and you ideally want to have 2 white and 2 red. But because we had gone so far out, the glide slope was way above us, and we spent a fair amount of time just flying horizontally so we could catch that glide slope and then start our descent into the field. So we want to have a nice stabilized descent. We set our power to about 20 something percent with full flaps. That should keep us gliding down at a shallow angle at about 7 to 8 knots. That's the magic number you more or less want to carry over the threshold, unless you've got a very short runway. And you probably want to have more if you're dealing with gusty winds, right? There's a lot of there's a lot of different factors that can go into deciding what speed you want to be flying at. If you are flying with no flaps at all and making a landing, you want to be flying at 88 knots. I've made a bunch of no flap landings for training. So there you can see there's 2 red lights and 2 white lights now on the left side of that runway. Just next to those white lights, that indicates that I'm pretty much on my glide slope, just aiming to touch the end of that runway. And yeah, I mean, this was about as stabilized as I've ever had it. Usually when you're coming down, you have a lot less time because you're trying to stay close enough to the runway that you can land it with no power if you have an engine failure just in the pattern. As we get down close to the runway, it's okay to see them all turning red. That's just normal because the slope indicator is a little further back from the runway threshold. So coming over the threshold, pull the power out, start to round out and flare, and there we go, hit touch on the runway. From this point, you're steering with your feet to try to stay on the center line. You're also pulling back on the stick to use the elevators to add braking and keep pressure off the front of the nose wheel as you're hitting the brakes to slow down and make that turn off the runway so that you can tell everybody that you are clear of runway 29er and that they can safely land. So yeah, that is a small part of a flight with some very nice footage that I wanted to share with those of you out there who are kind of interested as to what's going on. I'm Scott Manley. I am not a flight instructor. This is entirely my personal experience, and if you are wanting to learn to fly, go and get a real flight instructor. But yes, I'm Scott Manley. Fly safe.